I am Porter Shreve. I'm a novelist. And though my most recent novel was in part historical, I really come here as a fan of narrative history, and in particular, as a fan of T.J. Stiles. I'm going to give a brief introduction to T.J., and then I'm going to have a few questions of my own, and I really hope that toward the end, we can hear from some of you with questions as well. T.J. Stiles is the author of 3 works of nonfiction. His first book, Jesse James' Last Rebel of the Civil War, won the 2003 Ambassador Book Award and was a finalist for the 2003 Los Angeles Times Book Prize in Biography. His second book, The First Tycoon, The Epic Life of Cornelius Vanderbilt, won the 2009 National Book Award for nonfiction and the 2010 Pulitzer Prize for biography. His third book, Custer's Trials, A Life on the Frontier of a New America, was finalist for the 2016 National Book Critics Circle Award for biography. These are among many other prizes. These are just a few highlights. And he won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for history, his second. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow and a Fellow in American History at the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. He's an elected member of the Society of American Historians and a past faculty member of the World Economic Forum. He also holds a 5th degree black belt from the Japan Karate Association. If you go to his website, you can see all of the bones that he has broken. You won't see the bones, but you'll learn about the various things he has broken in his practice. And he teaches at a dojo in San Francisco still. As a member of the Council of the Authors Guild, he's been a tireless advocate for writers by supporting free speech, fair contracts, copyright, and much more. A native of rural Minnesota, he lived in New York for 20 years and now lives here in Berkeley with his wife and 2 children. TJ has been hailed, and I'm quoting from various prominent sources here, for his superb research, the stunning richness and sophistication of his work, for his breathtaking grasp of history, his ability to integrate economic, technological, intellectual, and political history, his ability to write state-of-the-art biography, crisper and more piquant than a 600-page book has any right to be. But I think what makes him one of the very best, and perhaps this is the key to his gaudy list of prizes and awards, is that he is great both as a historian and a biographer, as a researcher and a writer. He's adept at getting the facts right and getting to the emotional heart of the story, establishing context and immersing us in the psychological complexity of character. He's a writer, in short, both for the head and for the heart. He's a historian and biographer for writers. He's a historian and biographer for readers. If you haven't picked up his extraordinary books, I can't think of a better time. Welcome, TJ.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
So I thought I would begin at the beginning to a certain extent and get hear a little about how you came to become a writer and biographer, and maybe start with Foley, Minnesota, where you grew up. Rural farming community, mostly dairy farms?
It was. I grew up actually about a mile outside of a town of about 1,200 people.
Uh-huh.
And my father was the town doctor and the county coroner.
County coroner.
So it seems like a conflict of interest, but he got paid less for being a coroner. So, it was. It's interesting. True West magazine, which is a magazine for aficionados of Western history, asked me to answer a bunch of brief prompts, and one of them was, say something about growing up in Foley, Minnesota, and it's tough because you grow up in the country, and it's both a place that it's an experience that people don't have anymore. It used to be the normal experience is to grow up in a rural setting, in an agricultural setting, and so I'm really grateful for that. At the same time, it's hard. I mean, there's poverty. I had friends who had their hands mangled from injuries with farm equipment when they're 12 years old. There's a lot of alcoholism and abuse and domestic abuse, things like this happen. And there's a lot of anti-intellectualism. But at the same time, I had teachers who went out of their way to help me and make up for the lack of resources that we had in our community and that I wouldn't be writing without today. So, it's you can't romanticize it. And it contributes to something that I alluded to, sort of an Easter egg I planted for myself in Custer's Trials, where I talked about the particular allure that New York has for the provincial boy who is drawn to the cosmopolitan center. And that was definitely me. I always wanted to leave as soon as possible, while all my friends wanted to take over the family farm. Uh-huh. And so, there's an inherent tension in that. There's always something that's a part of me, and yet I look back and I realize I've spent most of my life trying to escape it at the same time.
Uh-huh. So looking back on the childhood, what from there made you, as you're reflecting on it, want to become a biographer and historian?
Well, one thing is there was nothing to do, so I read all the time. Mm-hmm. And I actually, we had the World Book Encyclopedia, and I would just pull it off the shelf. And I loved history. History is about everything. And so, I always had an interest in history, specifically, and I read a lot. And so when I went to college, I got a National Merit Scholarship to go to college at Carleton College, and small school, great place to go when you're from the country, and a great school. And, I really loved history. I loved doing it right. And one reason I majored in history is of the writing. Doing original research and then writing in a way that felt more original than in English, for example, with a lot of criticism. I declared an English major originally. And so I went to graduate school in New York at Columbia University, planned an academic career. And when I got there, my advisor who was supposed to show up, David Canadyne, didn't show up for 2 years. And, still today, academic departments can be a lot like feudal societies. You need a patron. Mm-hmm. If you're going to get funding, if you're going to get the things you need to advance, you need to have someone in those committee meetings saying, no, this is my person. He's great. I want him to, make sure he's in the program. Whereas I went through my first year was fine. My second year, I was subletting an apartment from this family of Romanians who, it turns out, were completely lying to me about the situation. It was a federally subsidized apartment, and the father, who had gone back to Europe, in fact, was living down the street. And when I confronted them about this, they tried to drive me out of my apartment, and we went to tenant-landlord court, and they harassed me 24 hours a day. And finally, and then I turned around and I was suing them, and meanwhile I was trying to go through graduate school. And then on Christmas Day, they drilled out my locks and stole everything I owned. And it was just a disaster. I was homeless for a couple of months and finally, got my footing again. And so, the third year, at the end of that year rolls around. I'm just hanging on by my fingernails. And I had a professor who came up to me and he said, "Oh, by the way, that A+ I gave you for that seminar your first semester." And I remembered he loved the paper that I did. He loved the presentation I did. He goes, "It must have been a mistake because I rarely do that." So I changed it to an A-. I'm like, what was that about? And then I realized that I had no one to stand up for me in the committee meetings, and someone must have said, "Ed, you must like him. You gave him an A." "Oh, no, not me." So, so it was tough. And so by my third year, I was like, okay, I'm just not doing this. I'm going to finish up, I'm going to go ABD, finish my coursework, and then find work. And because I was in New York, I through a series of accidents, I began to work in publishing. And what I was doing is working in the trade marketing division of Oxford University Press. And, and at the same time, I got a girlfriend who worked in publishing in a commercial house. And so now I'm very much immersed in the world of books specifically. Not academia, but books. And people who love and cherish books, learning about the ecosystem, the literary ecosystem, doing lots of reading outside of the specific field, books that are supposed to be for the general public, not all of them should have been, and then writing 300 words, then calling the authors, talking to them about it. My boss had an MFA in creative writing. People I worked with were often doing their own projects on the side. I don't know how many people I knew when I worked in publishing who were playwrights, and writing fiction and working on a screenplay. And, you know, it was full of people who were publishing an independent comic book. It was full of people who were in that field not because they were out to make tons of money, but because they loved art and literature and creative work. And so I still valued the scholarly values and the scholarly approach that I had learned and been trained in. And yet I also always loved reading, and I was immersed in this. So when I came back to, you know, I started to publish a few anthologies through a friend, really not a big deal. But when I came up with the idea for my first book, you know, because I had met somebody who was acquiring my books, and he said, okay, we can't just do this, we're pals now business. You've got to get an agent, you've got to do this right. And I'm really fortunate because he could have just tried to hoard my project, but he really watched out for me. And so I was a nobody. I was working in marketing and at that point, Ballantine Books. And I got a contract with Knopf. And a lot of it was, you know, proximity and the help of friends. But, you know, bringing that together is something that world of literature and those literary values and the scholarly values, and trying to create a book that succeeds as a book, as a narrative, as an immersive experience for the reader, and yet also says something new about the world. That's the approach that I've tried to take all the way through. And so that, you know, it does add to our knowledge, even though it's not addressed to a professional audience. And it does give that immersive, complete experience, even though I'm also trying to say something about the past that's fresh and new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you could have continued on the academic track, and so besides what was a really excellent job in publishing that gave you a sense of what's published, of how to encapsulate a book. And I mean, you were writing jacket copy, as I understand.
It was excellent as an apprenticeship. Mm-hmm. As in terms of income, no, it was terrible.
Right. But in terms of like understanding,
yeah.
You know, how can I encapsulate this 700-page book in something that's going to grab the interest of a general reader in what, 300 words?
Yeah, it's about 300 words. Yeah, it's really true. And what was interesting, I learned a lot of very valuable things from that experience. Not only, you know, little bits of advice that stick in your head and make a difference. And one of the things we would do is we would try to pull out interesting details that would, you know, kind of really engage the reader. And at one point, I was just really wrestling with something. And again, I asked my boss, who was was a creative writer himself. And he said, look, you're a reader. If it's interesting to you, anything that jumps out at you, that makes you go, huh, you know, that makes you want to tell someone else about it. That's what you look for. Mm-hmm. And it's like so simple and obvious, and yet it's so important. Mm-hmm. You know, you can overthink things and struggle with what to put on the page, and yet that jumps out. You know, that was something, for example, that led to my most recent book about Custer, who is a figure who is so, you know, he has passionate believers and he has passionate, haters who really disparage him, you know, and actually both for very good reasons. And there's been so much written about his life, and yet there was this one moment in his memoir of his first couple of years in the Great Plains, called My Life in the Plains, that I remembered because I'd read that book years before. And he was describing his march to his first successful battle against Native Americans at the Washita, which is a very controversial battle, again, for good reason. And they were marching through the snow, trying to surprise their foe in the middle of winter. And he said the blizzard was blowing so hard in the Indian territories, they marched across the plains, that you couldn't see the width of Broadway, referring to Broadway in New York. Mm-hmm. So here in the middle of this book about his adventures and how he had become a plainsman and a frontiersman is a cosmopolitan reference to New York. Mm-hmm. And that he wrote very deliberately. And that it wasn't like a light bulb went off and I saw the whole thing. That led me to think, that always kind of stuck with me. And the more I became a historian of 19th century America, the more I thought that is really interesting, that he's connecting those two. And what he's using his Western experience to actually give him currency, cultural currency in the cosmopolitan center. And, in writing about a life that's so defined by his death, in a way, trying to get at it that in a way that's not, the book is not defined by that event. That was my entry point. And it all comes back to that advice I got when I was, writing copy of, if something jumps out at you, then, that inherently, that's interesting because it's interesting you.
Mm-hmm. And so often that thing that's jumping out to you is exciting on a sensory level. I mean, it is immediately, you can grasp it immediately in your mind through the senses. Mm-hmm. So obviously you were reading a ton of history growing up. You were a history major. You went to Columbia on a fellowship for European history.
That's right, yes.
So, well, maybe talk a little about that and then how you transitioned into the 19th century.
Well, again, this has to do with where I went to work. I mean, accident is all about proximity. It's like Calvin Trillin said, his advice for how to meet your spouse is go to the right party. And, which is hilarious because, of course, you can never know which is the right party. But, being in a place where people are doing things that you're interested in leads to serendipity, which is the case with me. And so that was both by working in publishing, being able to start writing independently, and also being at the specific publisher that hired me. Oxford University Press had just published, right before I started working there, Battle Cry of Freedom, which is this masterful synthetic narrative of the Civil War era by James McPherson that's really credited with, as much as Ken Burns' documentary series, with igniting a new fire of interest in the Civil War. And it's just a masterpiece of narrative. I even drew upon it when I, again, was writing Custer's Trials on my third book. In Battle Cry of Freedom, when James McPherson, who was an academic historian, and one reason why I think there are a lot of great narrative writers that come out of history is because it's about change over time. So once they get tenure, they can write the books they've always wanted to write. Anyway, I'm joking. But so he got to Lincoln's assassination, and instead of describing this fantastic event, and there's a lot of wonderful, TikTok narrative in that book, he ends one chapter with John Wilkes Booth swearing he'll kill him, and he picks up the next chapter with 2 weeks after the assassination. And so it's an event we know so well. He could not make that event more alive and more powerful by actually taking us there, even though we know pretty exactly what happened. Instead, he leaves it off stage, which somehow actually increases the impact of that event. And so when I was thinking again about how do I write about Custer's life in a way that acknowledges the significance of the Little Bighorn and yet doesn't make the book about that. And I thought very specifically about that reference and ending one chapter with him riding away from his wife with the band actually playing The Girl I Left Behind Me. And then picking up the next chapter 2 years later, the epilogue actually, with the Reno Court of Inquiry meeting to convene as the Army tried to formally find out what exactly happened, and leaving it off stage, instead of trying yet again to recreate events that no one has ever been satisfied with in any account. Now, so when I went to this press, it was publishing a lot of great Civil War history, including more books by James McPherson, a lot of other historians. And I was trained in European history, and so I was interested in certain topics, and I'd been trained in theory that a lot of American historians are not so much, at least at the time. I shouldn't characterize the whole field. And things like Marxist theories of history, interest in banditry and peasantry and issues that in the U.S. are not always so prominent. And so when I was looking, reading so much history, and I did a copy on a book by a man who became really my mentor, Richard Maxwell Brown, who was a great historian of violence in American history, just one of the most generous human beings I've ever met. And he published this remarkable little book called No Duty to Retreat, about the origin of the legal theory that in America that in self-defense you have no duty to retreat. And all these stand your ground laws are related to that theory. And so he wrote about the American West and how it shaped a lot of aspects of American history. And he took seriously these iconic and celebrated and popularized events like the OK Corral and Wild Bill Hickok and all of these celebrated figures and events and clashes. And he, instead of debunking them, which is kind of the default setting for a serious intellectual inquiry to anything that's remotely popular, he took them seriously. He took the drama seriously. He wrote about them beautifully, but then he found the significance. And so that was a wonderful approach, I thought. It's so engaging, so nothing condescending about it, and yet, again, you have that aha moment. And so, and just the sheer drama, the physical drama, lives are at stake. And again, another academic historian who wrote wonderfully. So I began to think, I would like to get back to writing, and I would love to write history, but I want to write narrative. And so I wanted to write about the Civil War era and Reconstruction in a way that was one continuous narrative. Because intellectually, I'm very interested in the way in which our world has come into being, and those things which we take for granted today. Concepts about equality and civil rights, or with The First Tycoon, I wrote about the entire invisible architecture of the financial universe in which we live, which we rarely think about. And yet, there was a time when they were coming into being when people argued about the nature of money. What is a share of stock worth? And there were big public arguments about these things. And so that's very interesting to me. It's all compressed in this period, again, when the nation is literally, killing hundreds of thousands of ourselves in our fight over these issues. And so when I picked up Jesse James's this idea for a lot of reasons, again, I had that background with the theory of banditry E.J. Hobsbawm writes about in his works. And I had that theoretical background, and yet I was interested in the narrative, I was interested in the drama, and I was interested in the very specific setting in the United States. And so, that was a way in which I was able to bring in my background, even though I was writing now U.S. history. Mm-hmm. And so what's interesting is that book's very different from Custer. It's kind of a continuum, because the sources mandated that I write a different kind of book. And this is the thing with nonfiction, is that, your sources really, you wrestle with your sources. And so with Jesse James, he was a fugitive from the age of 16 until he died. The letters and the personal insights are few. And I just felt overjoyed when I got any sort of personal insight into his life. So it's a very contextual book. It's as much a history as a biography. And for that reason, academic historians love that book more than the others. It's very contextual. And then with Vanderbilt, there's much more of a biography, even though I wrestle with these other issues. But there was so much that was missing in terms of, I became more and more interested in the writing aspect as I went along, the narrative, the crafting the narrative, and bringing the characters alive, and immersing the reader in a fully realized world. And so when I got to Vanderbilt, the problem was, his inner state, his inner life, and the women in his life, so much of whose letters and diaries were not preserved. And that was a great frustration. And so I have his business career very well documented, and there's tremendous drama and significance in that. But there was something missing. And that was also something that led me to Custer. So well documented, and yet people have been interested in asking certain things about him. The West is interesting, or maybe the Civil War battles. And I was thinking, I want to write about not only him, but also, and not only his relationships with the women in his life, but their relationships with each other. There's a famous Bechdel test, kind of the bare minimum feminist test for a film, for example, where two women have to have a conversation about with each other, not about a man. And like most films fail this test. And I was finally able to write a book that passed that test. And that was important to me, because that's life, that's reality. That was this world, this specific life. But it also is a more literary narrative, in which characters are acting they're more three-dimensional characters who are capable of surprising you and have these complex interactions with each other. And so, I was interested in the self-emancipated woman who basically managed Custer's household and her relations with Libby Custer. And this woman, Eliza Brown, in many biographies, her last name is left out entirely. It's Eliza. Well, wait a minute. She actually picked the name Brown so she could name her, I think, so she could name her son John Brown after the famous, abolitionist. I mean, this is someone who, she chose that name, and people are leaving it out. They're just not interested in her. And Libby Custer was interested in her, even though they struggled as well as liked each other. And her memoirs are full of rich, fascinating information about her. Some of it disparaging, some of it admiring, and just people haven't been interested in it. And so, you can take an old, worn-out topic like Custer, and you can just look at who else is in the room and ask different questions and come up with a very different look that doesn't debunk and, negate everything that's been written before, but can come out, I think, fresh and different.
Yeah, I mean, I thought Libby and Eliza Brown were great characters, and particularly, I mean, they're more likable than Custer too. So in terms of like
really
as
helpful,
a reader,
yeah.
I mean, well, Custer's an enormously magnetic character, but here are these two characters who are also sympathetic,
Yes.
and I think in that way, I mean, it brought this great dimension to the book. It also made me wonder, not knowing the era as well, obviously, as you do, the extent to which, at the same time as being fully realized individual characters and really great secondary characters in the book, the extent to which Libby was a woman of her time, and the extent to which Eliza was or was not emblematic of the African American experience and of race relations of the time.
Well, this is interesting because you have to be aware, if you're writing in my case, setting is in history, in 19th century history, you have to touch base with the context. What is the experience? And especially when dealing with Eliza Brown before she shows up in Custer's life, you have to understand the history so you can sketch out what was her life like and take the few data points and put it together with what historians know so you can really get inside her experience. But there's two things about that. One is, of course, the importance for a biographer of secondary characters, and one of them is exactly the reason you said, because sometimes your main character gets really unlikable. And, Custer reminds me a lot of Walter White from Breaking Bad, where sometimes you're like, yeah, this guy's actually really great, I hope he does okay. And then you're like, wait a minute, he's horrible, he's killing people, he's making meth, and yet, his constantly creating disasters and then finding a way out of them. Custer was so volatile that, it's a great story, but you need sympathetic characters. And so just in terms of keeping the reader engaged, the importance of secondary characters in a biography is essential. But in terms of also, I'm also interested in the history. And so the question is, there's this tension between who the characters are and what the typical white woman of her class is, the typical African-American woman who's escaping from slavery. And, that idea is problematic because, when we write about people in the past, we want them to fit neatly into, there's a sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious desire for them to fill a certain role which fits our own moral architecture of the universe. And one really wonderful book, which I thought was very helpful when I was writing, that I read while I was writing Custer's Trials, was James McBride's Of the Good Lord Bird, in which you have, enslaved people who are the right and wrong of slavery is crystal clear, and yet at the same time, like, they're human beings who are living in the world, and they're seeking the advantages for themselves. And for this person, they may see the advantages of actually, I'm not taking those risks of trying to escape. I'm not going to be your noble archetype. Everybody is maneuvering and trying to find what advantages they can. And so when I wrote about Eliza Brown, helpfully, again, for making her sympathetic, she speaks out on racial issues. She's often defiant with the Custers, sometimes even makes fun of them to their faces. And she makes a point of bringing them into slave quarters and talking to them about what the impact of slavery. And yet she's also diverting food out of the general's mess to build her own patronage network among other escaped slaves. And she's finding the advantage in her position and making use of it. She is someone who's really an agent, and it's not like all these high-minded, even though you can clearly argue there's social justice in what she did, a larger justice, she wasn't thinking justice. She was thinking, I see what my angle is here, and I'm going to play that card I've been dealt. And same thing with Libby Custer. She's both this very well-educated woman who wrote in her diary and letters about how she resented the restrictions placed on her, and yet, she ultimately was not going to rebel against them. She was not going to go off with the suffragists and the women's rights organizations at the time. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton is not going to find Libby Custer there, even though I think she would have been very happy if the cause had succeeded. She's going to make the most of the situation that society and history has dealt her. And so, you have to touch base with what's going on and the people who are challenging those norms so that you can see, to what degree the characters actually felt they had a choice. And this is very important in dealing with the theme of race, which is so central to Custer's life, because he had a lot of views that he inherited and that millions of white Americans felt. And he was able to make progress in some. He embraced emancipation. He developed this personal relationship across the color line, had real respect for Eliza Brown. And yet, at a time when civil rights is literally being invented and written into the Constitution, when other Army officers who were his peers at West Point are embracing the cause of racial equality, he explicitly rejects it. And there are key moments in his life, and you can see him struggling with it, and then finally he makes his decision. And so it's easy, to simply condemn him and say, well, he was racist. But as a biographer, you have to say, did he have a choice? Were other people making choices? Did he explicitly reject this option? And in his case, early on, well, almost all white Americans went to war to preserve the Union, not to free the slaves. By the end, he's explicitly rejecting Reconstruction and civil rights. Mm-hmm. And so the answer, his situation, and the context allows you to understand the personal choice, the inner life, and is central to that. And again, that's part of the role of a historian, because ultimately, I didn't bang this drum, but you think, how do we get from a situation where we've got African American senators and congressmen and legislators, and where African Americans made the difference in Grant getting elected twice, and how do you get from there to Jim Crow? And people like Custer explain that. The millions of white Americans who resisted every step of the way and ultimately were able to triumph. And so, that's the embedded historical lesson. And yet ultimately, this is a book about an individual and a human being. Mm-hmm. And it cannot lose that, as a biography, it cannot lose that core, that essence. It's always about the person.
Yeah, I mean, what's so amazing is that you're 3 for 3 in terms of finding a figure on whom you can latch a history and speak to a period, while at the same time writing a compelling biography that a fiction writer and any reader would love to read. So I guess a couple questions out of that. Have you ever tried to write about a figure who just could not contain enough of the history that the book would be, for lack of a better word, big enough? Or have you ever found yourself, what are some of the, how did you do that? How did you seem to find the right figure every time? Or what are some of the challenges there? Or have you ever tried to sort of force a certain history on a certain character? You can talk about U.S. economics in the 19th century, and you're also talking about Cornelius Vanderbilt. There's no separating the two. You chose the right person, the first tycoon, and the right title. I guess, at what point do you know you've landed on the right person, or sort of however you want to answer that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Sometimes, I approach a book and, I have an interpretive angle at the beginning, and it bears out really well. And with Jesse James, my theory as I went in, as I worked on my proposal, was that his life was not about resistance to the railroads and banks, which existed in America, that he was, explicitly using his bandit career to build support for both himself as a Confederate avenger and for those who were resisting Reconstruction. And the more I learned, the more that bore out. And so it was like I became more convinced of it as I went along. And with Vanderbilt, though, his life was so vast and expansive that it was really the reverse problem. How do I contain this? And this is someone who was born in George Washington's presidency, who hired Daniel Webster as a lawyer, who was in a train wreck in a 3-car train with John Quincy Adams, who gave a ferry ride to Andrew Jackson, who was in business with P.T. Barnum, who made business deals with negotiated with Lord Palmerston, did business deals with John D. Rockefeller. I mean, it's this gigantic life, and how do you kind of like find what's important and shape the story, and that's difficult. Sprawl is actually easier than making things big enough often. And with Custer, it's again, because of the volume material, allowed me to have such an inner portrait of him, and again, a much more literary narrative to get as close to, as E.M. Forster writes, fiction is truer than history because fiction can take you beneath the surface. We all know from our own lives how much is beneath the surface. And what I think is, as a nonfiction writer, is that I'm constantly kind of knocking, if the surface is not water but glass, I'm constantly knocking on it and looking at the shadows underneath and trying to point out to what I think is there without faking it and pretending that I know exactly. I mean, yes, of course, somebody can write something about how they felt, or someone can describe them, and maybe they're wrong because it's all on the surface. And yet, there are certain signifiers that give you a sense better than others. And with Custer, he was so emotive and so volatile and so expressive, often to his detriment, that it allowed a much more of a sense of his inner life. And so there were so many areas of his life that he was, of American history, that he was throwing himself into. He was trying to make a go of it in finance. He was trying to become a writer and a public intellectual. He was an army officer, which means not only was he in battle, but he's a mid-level manager in the first large organization in America that set the institutional pattern for the corporate economy. And his struggles with the bureaucratic workings of the army are part of the story. He was an explorer. He was fascinated by natural history. And so, again, sprawl actually was more of a problem. I've yet to find somebody who can't bear that weight, and yet you have to find organic ways of if you're interested in something, you can't just throw it in and just like lump in your explanation or your digression. I believe that telling is a part of biography or history as well as showing. But it must feel like it's essential to the telling, that you have to have the reader invested in the narrative so that they feel like they must know what it is you're stopping the storytelling to explain to them. Here are the stakes. Here is where these people are coming from. This explains the characters. This explains the conflict. And you have to have a sense of the characters in conflict before you can do that. In Custer's trials, I have this like explicit trick where before I talk about the larger shape of the conflict with the High Plains peoples on the Great Plains, I wait until Custer's on his first expedition, 1867, that leads to the first war against American Indians that he embarks in. And I literally wait until he's met some native leaders, he's been in a conference, he's intruded on a dinner, they're riding toward this village, and they meet a line of warriors lined up, and everyone expects a battle. And it's a cheap trick, and I'm very happy I did it. And then I stop, and I say, okay, what is this all about? So that the reader knows, okay, it's a cliffhanger, you're coming back to that battle, that imminent battle, but, why is there a conflict? And then I can talk about the environmental issues, and talk about the political conflict, and the nature of settlement versus migration and trade, and how all these things have led to this moment. And so, I'm creating, as a writer, everything has to serve the reader's experience. And so understanding is a part of that experience. Knowledge is a part of that experience. And yet, I'm not providing a series of encyclopedia entries. I'm creating an organically complete, as much as I can make it, narrative. So when you finish it, you feel like you've finished, a complete book, not something that was fragmented and mosaic-like, but something that was organically complete and true. And so that those moments of telling there has to be something organic in the story that they're about. Otherwise, they don't belong there.
I mean, this sounds exactly like Fiction Workshop. I mean, really. Yeah. I mean, begin in medias res. I mean, the Vanderbilt book also starts. I mean, it starts after his death, but it starts with a trial. It starts in a dramatic situation, a contested will, which so many great 19th century novels are about that very thing. So many great novels are about that. And then once you've established that hook, you go back into, well, to the beginning. But and are there able to do some more of that showing. And so it's a very, very effective narratively.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is that this is something David Lodge talks about in his book of actually newspaper columns, I think, The Art of Fiction, where he talks about the difference between suspense and mystery. And when you're writing nonfiction, actually now, to quote my friend Ethan Waters, he says, when you're a nonfiction writer looking what to write about, write about what you don't know about what you know. And that's a good rule for nonfiction writers. You're telling people what they don't know about what they know. So people, they may pick up a book about a guy who I bring into every book I write, Adelbert Ames, who was not a classmate, a year ahead of Custer, who was like the opposite of Custer. He was both a boy general in the Civil War, but he was non-flamboyant. He believed in civil rights. He was adapted very well to the new America that he helped make. But nobody's heard of him, and nobody's going to care about him. And so they're just the traction that people have on the subject is not going to lead them into the book. You write about Custer, and not only do you have a more volatile figure, it's actually probably more fun to write about, but you have people, okay, they have a known quantity, and then you give them the unknown aspect of that quantity. That's what you do. And if you don't have anything unknown to write about, you either have to resign yourself to telling the same damn story again, hopefully better, or you find a different subject. Yeah. And my choice is, if I can't find something new way to look at it, to have people kind of sit back and say, that's it, wow, that's fascinating, then I should be working on a different subject. Yeah. And so, that's the thing, is setting up a book like that, a narrative. I have to give the reader a sense of where we're going, if they don't already know, a sense of why this life matters. And with Custer, I don't really need to. Like, we know this is a big dramatic life. So I didn't begin with, I have a preface, but you can skip the preface if you want to. I begin at West Point, not with his birth, but at West Point. And with Vanderbilt, it was this huge life, and people are sort of aware of the name of Cornelius Vanderbilt, but they might not quite know how significant he was. So by opening with the trial after his death, it shows like the conflict he generated, the scale of his life, the sort of this is where we get to at the end, is this titanic, figure who never held public office yet towered over American life. And so that sort of, signposts the whole thing, tells us where we're going. I forget who had actually said this, but one definition of plot is something, again, my old boss at Oxford used to say, and I forget who he was quoting, is that you create expectations and then fulfill them. Yeah. Though you probably know who it was who said that. The fulfillment may be different from what they expect, but people know they're going someplace. Mm-hmm. And so if they really know where you're going, like with Custer, like, yes, we know how it ends, then you're dealing in, you may have shorter segments that are suspense. You don't know how this battle goes, et cetera. And yet the whole thing is a sense of mystery. How is it that we got to this end? How did it's the story of the story, how did it unfold? Mm-hmm. So, that's a lot of writing history, is kind of balancing they're not even mutually exclusive, but those kind of two ways of thinking about storytelling.
Yeah. This is a good time to bring you all in if you have questions for TJ. Yeah, there's a roving microphone. Here it comes.
And I'm happy to answer questions about...
Oh, actually, sure, okay.
Oh, right. Oh,
that
sorry, you've
sounds
got to
good.
retreat. We've got to send
Yeah,
you away. I'm happy to answer questions about specific subject matter, or if you want to ask me about the Little Bighorn, which my book isn't about, you can certainly do that, or about writing. Anything is fine.
Okay, I think it's more about writing. You were talking about your interpretive angle when you start a project. Is that sort of the same as like a thesis or a premise, or like something that you want to prove or disprove by the end? Do you have something like one sentence so that when you get to the end of the book, you're like, yeah, this is the basic thing that it's about? You start it like that?
Yes, absolutely. But it kind of depends. Sometimes a subject can be so big that what you have to say about them may not be so easily condensed. With Vanderbilt, the one sentence is more of a descriptor rather than a thesis about him. That Vanderbilt is a central figure in the making of the modern American economy, and that in his life, not only did he physically create industries and organizations and volumes of wealth and wealth disparity that we still deal with today, but the basic concepts of our economy emerge in his life. And so I don't have like some specific thesis like the secret to Vanderbilt is this, or he was too big for that. Custer and Jesse James died in their 30s. And so it was easier to get at it. And also they're very well-known figures in a way. There's been a lot written about their lives. And so I had to really think about it. A way I put it in Custer's trials is that I'm not out to debunk everything that's been written before. I'm changing the camera angle. What do I have to say about this subject? I'm not just going to tell the story again. What does it have to say? And so with Custer, I can reduce it to a sentence. Here's a person who helped to create the modern world and yet was never able to adapt to it. That his life was about the destruction of slavery, the establishment of civil rights, the creation of a unified nation state, the destruction of native autonomy and the sort of consolidation of federal power in America, the rise of literary culture, the rise of Wall Street. All these things are a part of his life, and he's engaged in them. And yet his life is so volatile in part because he could never really adapt to all these aspects of modernity he's helping to create. So now, you go into the specifics in the book, and, that applies it to varying degrees of truth. With Jesse James, I had this very specific idea. He was not American Robin Hood. He was really more of a kind of early prototype of the terrorist that he was using. He was an outlaw, he was a criminal, he was a violent person by nature after the Civil War, and yet his life was about using violence to promote a political cause and a political understanding of himself. And so, so that's a really clear thesis. But sometimes you have a subject that's too big for that. And so, you have to have a sense of, with Vanderbilt, like the early part of his life is about the rise of competition and the whole making of the idea of competition. And later in life is, it's just like his life brings out some of the major themes in that thing. But often you can really get down to a nugget. And of course, you're going to find complexities and aspects of your work that may not fit. But if you can say, this is what's fresh, this is what I have to say that is not going to ring, that I haven't seen in other writing about this subject, then you've got a real entry point into getting people interested in your subject.
Maybe I don't need that. Hello, Mr. Stiles, and welcome to this holy pulpit of the Frame Salvage Stage.
Thank you.
I'm an accidental history buff,
Mm-hmm.
and presently my shelf is graced with two biographies of Custer subjects,
Mm-hmm.
T.J. Stiles and Daniel Gilbert. It's the biographer's work that intrigues me as much as the Custer book. I'll offer you a comment on the biographer's work and invite your response. Any biographer who is not too stupid or too full of himself to see what he's doing knows that what he does is morally indefensible.
Well,
Do you recognize it?
yeah, yesterday actually, it's very funny because yesterday I was at, there's an organization that's fairly new that a friend of mine helped organize, so I'm on the advisory board. It's called BIO, the Biographers International Organization. And they run a really wonderful conference every year in which people get together and talk about the craft of writing biography. And in going there, I had a conversation as a part of the events with Annette Gordon-Reed, who is the great Jefferson scholar and just a national treasure, because she's a great scholar, and at the same time, she is just a great writer and talks wonderfully about writing. And in her new book, she did with Peter Orniff, about Jefferson, there's this wonderful quote where someone late in life, a would-be biographer, asked Jefferson for the names of his grandchildren. He said, "What on earth would you want the names of my grandchildren for in a biography? Like, nothing personal should ever be in a biography. No one wants to hear that stuff." I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but like people want to read about the public life. That's what a biography is. And then later that day, Claire Tomlin, who's just fantastic, wonderful writer, was talking about how really morally indefensible the biographer's trade is, like rummaging through old letters, going through the most intimate details. In my book on Custer, I cite letters, quote letters, and make clear references to Custer and his wife's oral sex, among other things. It is morally indefensible. It's very intimate. And yet, this is this is why I write about dead people, So, unfortunately, Custer appears to have been sterile, so I don't have anybody, any descendants chasing me. But this is the craft, is that you're writing biography. It is again, where in my case the scholarship is history, where scholarly values and literary values meet. And what is literature? It's about the human condition. It's about what it means to be a person moving through the world. And so that means the big issues about the aggregate, which is what scholarship tends to be about, humanity, and the literary writer is about the human being. And so, I'm interested in both, but ultimately I'm trying to bring out that experience of what it is to be a person. And so, so I'm really invading his privacy. And Claire Tomlin was talking about how maybe she was telling her husband, maybe we should burn our letters. And he was like, "You're a biographer, how could you say that?" But she was starting to think about, what if somebody wrote about me? And she horrified her, And so it's a good point. And yet it's an inherent part of what we do. We're digging up dirt and making someone look bad or trying to apologize for them, you're in trouble. We're looking for the complexity, the contradictions. Like when Custer's at his worst, when he's cheating on his wife, I think, or engaged in opposing civil rights. Okay, how do I keep before the reader the fact that people who knew him loved him? That he had a sensitivity to his wife's emotional state and a need for her that allowed them to get past these crises he created. How do I keep the contradictory aspects when it can seem so stark in one respect? And you've got to build this intimate understanding of the human being to understand things that otherwise would be inexplicable. And so, that's the task. And which can also seem morally indefensible in another sense. Because, Custer and people for very good reasons find him to have played a morally abhorrent role in American history. And there's certain aspects of his life where I can see exactly where you're coming from. But my job is to present him as a man in full, because then you don't understand why people loved him if you're out to focus in on this one aspect. And people can write those books, and that's fine, but I'm writing the whole life. So, sometimes what I'm doing is morally reprehensible in the outer sense, and sometimes in the inner sense, and yet it's part of the task.
If I can add just to that, you poke yourself a bit with your own sword when you retreat to the safety of only writing about dead persons.
Yes.
Your very work enlivens them again, brings them from the grave, presents them as living, breathing beings for us all in a contemporary mode.
I'll take that as an endorsement. I don't know if it is, but okay, thanks. Thank you. Yeah, that's the task, yeah.
Oh, last question. Okay. You use the adjective fresh several times and as a goal for your writing and what you can bring to a subject. And it sounds like in the case of Jesse James, you had a thesis at the outset that provided that fresh perspective for you. I wanted to know with your other subjects how much research you have to go through before you know or confirm that you have a fresh perspective to the story.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and you know, having a good editor sometimes helps. I'll just use it when it closes with one example about my second book, The First Tycoon, where again I came into it having more knowledge from the kind of the Civil War era, and Vanderbilt died when he was just before his 83rd birthday, so he was and he went to into business at the age of 16, and so he had this amazingly dense, long career. And I was more familiar with it at the outset with the latter part, but of course I was writing about the early part early on. And so, and I got carried away with, again, interest in this major lawsuit. And so I delivered the first few chapters to my editor, and they were bogged down with details because no one else had written about them before, and yet had no sense of what it was about. And he said, I don't know what it is, but you're missing something big. You're missing something. And so what did I do? I had to go back and said, you know what? I just don't know the world. I've got to go back and know that world. And so I was reading, you know, the historiography of the early republic. And I was reading about, you know, the 18th century culture of deference and the sense of a hierarchical society and the way that our economic thinking, you know, Hamilton is lauded these days as the great forerunner of modern capitalism. And he was a genius, and yet he was embedded in that world. He was a mercantilist. You know, he thought in ways that we don't think now today. And so getting at Vanderbilt as a person who was engaged in a battle early on that helped to destroy this 18th century society, and that, you know, this, you know, it took me into a whole era. Once you go a little bit farther back, then all of a sudden, wow, you know, what's happening in this period I'm writing about looks totally different. And it's about something I didn't even see before. So there are struggles, you know, where you know, you need feedback. You know, you need to have other people read it and react. And they may not even be experts in the field. They may know nothing about it. But if they're good readers, in my case, I have one of the best editors in the business who I've worked with through all my books, which is exceptionally rare in publishing. You know, and he's able to identify those problem spots. And, you know, I'm in it for the work. I'm not in it as a vanity project. If it's not working, then I've got to go bang my head against the wall and think about why. And so sometimes it's difficult. And sometimes you have to be willing to, you're writing for an audience, you're speaking to the world. And so you've got to get that feedback. You've got to touch base with people and think hard about what the criticism and reactions mean. Sometimes people are trying to be nice. You're like, it's good, you know? And you're like, okay, what is it? You know, what is not good? That's what I want to know. You know, that's what you want to hear. Emotionally, you want the pat on the back. But to really make the work worthwhile, you've got to zero in on the negative stuff and then think it through, think it farther. Often finding what's interesting is not accepting the old explanation. You know, in biography, there's often kind of like a accepted version. Oh, this is this. And it doesn't make, you know, like if you think about it for a few minutes, it doesn't make sense. And yet people have just gotten in the habit of just seeing it in a certain way. And so, you know, with Custer, like, you know, he made the 7th Cavalry exchange horses, so all the different companies had the same color horses. Everybody's always said, oh, you know, he was into appearances, he was flamboyant. Actually, in the 19th century battlefield, there's the commander on the field looking around for his men. And like, oh, there's the gray horse troop. And interestingly, one of the people who criticized him most, Captain Benteen, who hated the coloring the horses, they called it, this horse exchange. In the trial, the Court of Inquiry about the Little Bighorn, he said, well, I knew they were retreating because I saw the gray horse troop was coming back. In other words, the whole logic of why Custer did that is actually proven by his greatest critics' testimony. And all of a sudden, that pat explanation falls apart once you think about the world from a different point of view. You know, not accepting the way things have, and thinking it through can really give you new insight and let you look at things fresh.
Thank you all so much for coming out.